When I was a young boy, my father told me that the skull of your grandfather is German. That's what my father knew about this thing.
That's Zablon Kiwelu. In the first episode, we spoke about the execution of Mangi Meli and other leaders in Tanzania. Among those leaders executed that day was Zablon's grandfather, Sindato.
His body, his skull, was one of those that was taken back to Berlin, and quite recently it was positively identified with DNA as being part of Berlin's collection of stolen human skulls and skeletons. And a few weeks ago we met his grandchildren who'd come to the city.
They'd come to the city to see the skull of Zablon's grandfather.
Sunday was happy, Monday was happy, but Tuesday, it's a really pain. I'm not happy. Before I saw this skull, I wasn't happy, but now, it's really pain.
All his life, he heard about his grandfather being killed and his skull taken away, and now he was being confronted with it. He and his nephew, Sindato, the great-grandson.
Actually, I'm the one who took my grandfather's name. I'm Sindato, and it's called Sindato. We came together to Germany to pay a tribute to the skull of our grandfather.
We met them just after they had encountered him, and they were not able to bring him home. They weren't permitted to take him back.
Yeah, the man in charge of the museum said that he doesn't have the problem of giving out the skull. He wishes if he could give it to us, but he doesn't have that power. He says that the power is between the government of Germany and the government of Tanzania.
You know, it's surprising. They have a DNA match. It's a confirmed identification. It's not like with Mangi Meli or something that they're still hunting for it. They know these are the descendants, but...
It's bureaucracy, and it's not going to happen right now.
Yeah, and we had to ask them, well, how did it feel to be in the room with your grandfather's skull?
Today, Tuesday, is the day which I cannot forget in my life. Going to see the remains of my grandfather.
They took to a room where the skull was with flowers on the table. It was on the table. So we are there in the room with the skull. So we did pay our tribute there. We did make a prayer. We actually cried, and we feel very sad.
It's really pain. It's really pain. It's really touching inside. It's really touching.
But they're still holding out hope.
In fact, he told us that they are preparing a small coffin. Anytime if they are told to give it, they will give it to us.
Welcome to Dig Where You Stand. I'm Ben Schumann-Stoller from Colo Media.
I'm Peter Matthews, a writer at the Berliner magazine.
Thanks for coming back. We're talking about the ancestral remains being held in museums here in Berlin. If the question driving the first episode was, why were these remains taken and how did they get here? In this episode, episode 2, we're going to ask another basic question. Why can't we just give them back? It seems like the obvious right thing to do.
I think it is the right thing to do. But I think what we want to look at in this episode is how these human remains or ancestors are still being used politically. They're powerful symbols of something that, particularly on the side of the former colonizers, people don't really want to look at.
Nobody wants to seriously look at them and question what it means. So we're going to look at that blind spot. We're going to look at what happened the first time Germany tried to return human remains on a large scale, which happened in 2011.
Yeah, that was the first time that this particular subject was really dealt with in any kind of systematic way, I think. It means that we shift where we were talking about in terms of the country of origin for these remains. The first episode, we were talking about Tanzania, which was at the time of the collection known as German East Africa. Now we're moving and we're looking at what's today Namibia and what was then German Southwest Africa.
This episode contains depictions of violence that some people may find disturbing.
A century after Germany slaughtered tens of thousands of Namibians to use in research, 20 of the skulls have been repatriated. Namibia's colonial ruler at the time, Germany was trying to prove the racial superiority of Europeans. Demonstrators want Germany to return the remaining skulls and pay compensation.
So in 2011, here in Berlin, It was the first time that Germany really attempted a return of human remains to one of their former colonies. And at that time, the collection, the S collection actually, that we spoke about in episode 1, it was held in the Charité hospital.
They undertake a project of provenance research. They invest a lot of time and money into it and determine that 20 skulls in their collection are from Namibia. And then they invite the Namibian government to a reception. It becomes a huge event. It makes international news.
Yes, but not for being a success.
It was kind of the opposite of a great success. We have footage of this event at the Charité hospital when a 70-person strong Namibian delegation comes to Berlin to meet these skulls and to take them home.
So when you look at the footage, there's this kind of large auditorium. The Namibian flag is draped over the stage. The whole front row of the audience are people from Namibia dressed in these really quite striking costumes. The men are wearing customized military uniforms, and the women have these large headdresses where...
Yeah, they're actually supposed to represent cow horns, right? Because this is the part of the delegation from Namibia that are Herero, and they're traditionally cattle farmers.
And there's a sort of tense atmosphere.
There's activists, there's protesters there in the auditorium.
Yeah, in the frame they're just cut off, but there's actually a lot of people standing along the side.
Yeah, you don't get the feeling it's like one of these normal, boring, choreographed, diplomatic...
Yeah, there's kind of an expectancy or like an anticipation of something. And then most strikingly of all, I think there's these two skulls. You can't really see them in the footage, they're so small. But once you know what they are, it's quite a stark image because you've got everyone talking while these two skulls in a glass box are placed on a long table in the middle, just looking out at the audience. And a German minister comes to the podium and begins to make a speech. And as it goes on, the sort of tension builds because people seem to be waiting for her to say something, which...
Yeah, they're waiting for an apology. They think Germany's going to admit its responsibility for a genocide on their people. How could they not? The skulls are there, right there, staring out at them. The evidence is on the table. The moment has come for them to say sorry for this crime. But she doesn't.
Genocide. Yes.
What is going on here? You'd think this is a good moment. Germany has to give these ancestral remains back, and they are. This is the giving back ceremony. And here's a video of people yelling.
Yeah, I think in order to understand what is happening in this room at this particular moment, we need to actually go a little bit further back and explain about what happened in German Southwest Africa at the beginning of the 20th century when these remains were collected.
Let's start at the beginning. Just to place everybody, Namibia is on the Atlantic coast of Africa, just north of South Africa, on the border of South Africa. And it's called Namibia because of the desert, the Namib, which for hundreds of years, European sailors would pass this land. And it was this big desert on the coast, and they couldn't see anything except for desert.
Right. One of the reasons it was maybe ignored a bit by the colonizing powers was because from the ocean, there didn't appear to be much there.
Germany, anyway, comes to colonialism later than the other European countries that we know of.
Yeah, they sort of get Namibia in the Berlin Conference in 1884 when Africa is carved up. And yeah, I think there's an element of them trying to make up for lost time. They're envious of the wealth of the other European nations from their colonies, and they dream about those riches, but at the same time they're worried. And they call it the Torschluss panic, the panic of the closing door. They feel the need that they're behind and they need to hurry up.
When German Southwest Africa, that's what Namibia was called then, begins as a German colony, it's actually costing the empire money. It's not making money.
Yeah, and I think there's an element of kind of fantasy to their approach, a sort of unreality, which can be seen from the start. And quite clearly, really, in the figure of the first imperial commissioner, a man called Heinrich Göring.
Heinrich Göring, not Hermann Goering.
Well, his father, the father of Hermann Goering, who would be Hitler's second in command, well, his father was the first governor of German Southwest Africa.
In the portrait of him on Wikipedia, he's got a very large forehead, and he's wearing a black, like, formal attire. So he's not wearing a military uniform.
Yeah, he's got a big sort of a fluffy moustache and those tiny little glasses.
Yeah,
but
he looks like a bureaucrat. He looks like an administrator. He's not presenting as a military person.
Yeah, I find it difficult to read the clothes of the time, but I read it through his son a bit. You know, he's wearing a kind of, is that a cravat or a tie or something? And his son was such a dandy, you know, so I imagine him along those lines as well. When he arrives, you know, there's a small German force and he's not very effective. For the most part, the native people ignore him.
They've heard about colonialism. They're like, we know what you're trying to do. We're not going to sign your treaties. We're not going to let you take our land.
Yeah, and there were two peoples or nations that he was dealing with. There were the Herero, kind of cattle-rearing people that came from the north, and the Nama, who'd come up from South Africa, partially forced away by the British. And they were very modern, you know, they used rifles, they rode horses, wore uniforms, often spoke German, Dutch, and English along with their native languages.
They sent their children to missionary schools. They wore, tailored jackets and tunics. And
I mean, they've both moved there with their own processes, and so they're quite sort of contemptuous of Goering and his little German force that wants to make them sign protection treaties.
Again,
and stuff.
they think they're coming to some kind of colony from the 16th century.
And
we're in the 1880s here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, both people, the Herero and Nama, were much more modern than that fantasy would imply, obviously. And yeah, Goering, the imperial commissioner, he was being ignored, really. You know, they didn't want to sign the treaties. And one of the Nama leaders, Henrik Witbooi, he writes these amazing letters.
I wish we could do a whole show about him. So he's a Nama leader, and Goering summons him or whatever, and Witbooi writes back and he says, I am a free and autonomous man answering to none but God, so I have nothing further to say to you. A representative, Goering is just a representative of the Kaiser, whereas Witbooi is his own, like the king of his own people. He says, a representative has less power than an autonomous man. I see no reason to follow your summons at this point. He just says, piss off, basically.
Yeah, there's lots of times like that. He's very wise about all the different power structures at play and knows his position within them in a way.
To get back to Goering, he knows he needs to do something. He's failing. He's trying to figure out a way to get the empire to like invest in the colony.
It's a waste of money for the Germans at this point. But then in August of 1887, there's a big development. Australian gold diggers report finds of gold in Southwest Africa. And
sweet.
Yeah. A big success for Goering. He's struck gold. It's the best thing that could have happened for Goering, and people set out to, you know, there's a rush. People set out to find their fortune. Prospectors are running down there, and Goering actually goes back to Germany and he gives a report confirming it all. He gives his personal account of the situation, and apparently, you know, it bolstered confidence among the government and business interests that yes, this was a major find.
Right, except that it wasn't.
No, it's a hoax. I mean, it turns out someone, very likely Goering himself, ordered muskets to be filled with gold and shot into the rock face. And that gold was then discovered.
Right, totally planted.
Yeah, it was this kind of big stroke of luck was a lie.
Yeah. Yeah, and it doesn't really matter if it was Goering himself who did it or not. I mean, it served its purpose. So people went, resources were sent, it gained attention.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, Goering was ultimately dismissed, but
actually, he also disturbs some ancestral remains. He builds or extends a building over sacred burial grounds.
Yeah, it's
disturbing some remains. Yeah,
exactly. It's interesting that sort of human remains are part of the story from the start. You know, people are offended because he's disrespecting the place, and so there's an uprising against him, and he leaves. But also, it's quickly apparent too that this gold isn't really there. But nevertheless, they've already sent more forces, they've sent more settlers. Yeah, as we said, the hoax sort of served its purpose.
And then he leaves, and there's this dynamic. Each time a new governor is appointed, things tend to get worse. I mean, we're not going to go through every single administrator of...
Yes, but I think that kind of... the sort of fantasy of these primitive people and the enormous wealth that's going to be there, there's this way that they kind of kid themselves. They tell themselves it's going to be a massive success, because they're going to get all of this money. These people are incredibly backwards, and they're going to be easy to sort of brush aside. But there's also another kind of a sort of story which they're believing in increasingly, which is this more modern essentialist way of seeing the world, which is the rise of biological or scientific racism.
Yeah, we talked about a little bit in episode 1, right? Like all these scientists, these expeditions, these university people, coming down or from hospitals, like all these modern intellectuals now dealing with this topic of sort of humanity and
yeah, when we spoke about the first collection of human remains and the founding of the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, it was this idea to sort of establish an archive of humankind, that all of these tribes or peoples around the world were being wiped away or would pass away from the storm of approaching modernity. But then there's almost a change, which is their interest is less in that kind of, romantic idea of the passing away. And now it's more, the science becomes more about proving things like the degeneration of whiteness, how mixing with local tribes can lessen a people. And there's this kind of essentialist, really brutal science which comes to appear. And we see that in the collection of human remains as well. As there's different stages of the colonialism, that's reflected in the different uses to which the human remains are being put, which are sent back.
Right. So we can't do like all 30 years. We're not going to go through every administrator. We're not going to go through every battle. We got to stick with the human remains, but so that people know where we're at, the genocide of the Herero and Nama people that we have to talk about now happens from 1904 to 1908. We're talking about how the human remains are collected. They're collected through different stages of colonialism, right? That's what you were saying.
Just as the human remains are collected in different stages in Namibia itself, there's also, we find in the Berlin museums, human remains from different places in the world. There's from German East Africa, from the Boxer Rebellion in China. There's a huge amount of human remains which are sent back from Namibia. And in each of those places, it's where one person was in military command, and that was the person who arrives in Namibia in 1904, which is a German general called Lothar von Trotha.
Yeah, not that he was the only one killing everybody and bringing all these remains back, but
no, but he had a certain policy here.
Exactly, yeah. He embodies this to a certain extent, and like you said, he was in China, he was in Tanzania, he was in Namibia, and unlike Heinrich Goering, when you look up a picture of von Trotha, he's in all the military gear, big black boots, scary cane. He's
got that kind of folded over hat of the Schutztruppe. I don't know if it is the Schutztruppe, but I associate it with them.
He is a scary man who killed thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
Yeah, there's reports, maybe we'll come to some of them later, where he's literally like riding through the desert, finding people dying of starvation and shooting them in the head and then marching on. He's an incredible brutish figure, but
he's known as a guy who does not try to negotiate. He only uses military force. That's his thing.
And he declares it openly. He writes in 1904 in a letter, he says, "I know enough tribes in Africa. They all have the same mentality insofar as they yield only to force. It was and remains my policy to apply this force by absolute terrorism and even cruelty. I shall destroy the rebellious tribes by shedding rivers of blood and money. Only then will it be possible to sow the seeds of something new."
It's hard to find a better representation of what you were talking about, how colonialism has shifted into something different than like the paternalistic colonialism that we were familiar with from earlier centuries. This is just pure killing.
Yes, exactly. Rather than sort of manipulating people in order that they fight each other and you play them off and divide and rule.
It's just wiping them out.
This is just about wiping them out. This is just about getting rid of the people and clearing the land and murdering everyone.
The way the killing starts, first von Trotha wins this battle against the Herero at a place called Waterberg. For months after beating the Germans in a different battle, the Herero had gathered here at Waterberg in a sort of mountainous inland area that was right on the border of a massive desert. And von Trotha is looking for a decisive way to start his mission of annihilation. And over time, the Germans start gathering around Waterberg. They start taking up positions in a ring around it, encircling it. The Herero, coming off this victory and in favorable conditions, are assuming that negotiations will begin at some point. They're reassured. They even invite a German group to tour their camp. They're unaware of all the new troops arriving, slowly closing the trap, because it's unthinkable that the Germans would attack their entire encampment with all the Herero families and women and children. And it's not just Herero soldiers there.
No. It's the whole people.
And they attack with overwhelming force, with modern weapons, like the newest weapons from Europe.
There was a novel, it was a best-selling novel in the early 20th century called Peter Moore's Journey to Southwest Africa. And it was a German author writing for the German public, but the author had been there at the time. And in this novel, he talks about how he saw this large Herero encampment. He says, "I gazed at the great night scene with sharp spying eyes, and I observed minutely the site and the camp at the base of the mountains. Still the thought went through my head, there lies a people, with all its children and all its possessions, hard pressed on all sides by the horrible deadly lead and condemned to death, and it sent cold shudders down my back."
And what happens at Waterberg is the Herero are surprised by the force of the German attack, and they're forced to retreat in one direction, and that direction is out into the desert. And the Germans fire at anybody who try to go any other direction, and they're forced into the desert where they're pursued, where the last few watering holes are poisoned, where women and children are shot at when they turn around and ask for help and water and food.
Yeah, after the Battle of Waterberg, the people flee into the desert and they are completely scattered. And then there's lots of reports afterwards of German soldiers, moving through the desert, finding people dying of thirst or starvation and just bayoneting them, killing them, executing them, because there's an official policy which comes from von Trotha, which has never really been done before. He issues a statement. It's a chilling document because it's written with an element of this same fantasy that we saw from the start, in this pidgin German, which assumes it's talking to people who have no idea or who don't understand, who are sort of like children.
I'll read a couple sentences from it. So this is from the extermination order. He says, "I, the great general of the German soldiers, send this letter to the Hereros. The Hereros are German subjects no longer. The Herero nation must now leave the country. If it refuses, I shall compel it to do so with the long tube, or the great roar."
Exactly. I, the great general, have the big gun, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And he says, "I shall spare neither women nor children. I shall give the order to drive them away and fire on them. Such are my words to the Herero people." It's chilling, and it's also, I think, an important document and documentation of this genocide, because there you have it, black and white.
Yes, he's announced his intention to execute everyone in the spot.
This extermination order is issued. Like you said, people are scattered in the desert and around the land. And von Trotha and the German forces aren't done killing them.
Well, they move across the land, killing people wherever they find them, hanging people, bayoneting them. There's some of the most brutal reports you can have. And then also, this is the time when they start, exactly just after the Battle of Waterberg, the first people are interned in one of the most notorious concentration camps. I mean, there's a few concentration camps that they start to erect in Namibia, and the most notorious one is in Luderitz Bay on a sort of barren island called Shark Island. It's surrounded by sharks and it's very cold, windswept, inhospitable.
Like exposed.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, we're talking about concentration camps, and people might, it's surprising that there are concentration camps in Namibia. Not everyone knows this. Concentration camps were not a totally new thing in colonialism. The British had used them also.
Yeah.
So it's not like a totally new thing, but it's the first time Germans used them as an official policy, as an official strategy. And they start rounding up Herero first and then Nama people in these concentration camps. And they're ostensibly being put to work, but we know that they pretty much just exterminated. I mean, pretty much the attempt was to kill them.
I mean, on Shark Island, people were being worked to death. One prisoner on Shark Island was a Nama called Fritz Isaac. He says that after the war, I was sent to Shark Island by the Germans. We remained on the island for 1 year. 3,500 Hottentots and Kafirs, another tribe, were sent to the island, and only 193 returned. 3,307 died on the island. So, it's a like 90% mortality rate for those people. I mean, the mortality rate was incredibly high throughout, and there's the most horrific reports you can ever imagine coming back from the place. And the reason that Shark Island is so significant for our story in a way is that it was a major site of collection for human remains, and there were medical officers doing experiments and sending back huge numbers of human skulls and human body parts back to Berlin. And there was even a suggestion that there was such a sort of glut of human material being sent back at this time that there was a change in medical science. Instead of measuring skulls, they went to doing things like examining musculature and soft tissue, because they had just such a vast amount of human bodies with which to experiment. Finally, there's an article published in a medical journal in 1913. It's written about these human remains which are sent back from Shark Island in specific. And these are the exact human remains which are being sent back in 2011. So some of the skulls that we see facing the table are very likely from this shipment of skulls. Yeah. And in the report there are these drawings. If you see them here.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And so these are drawings of the 17 heads that were sent back from Shark Island. And you can see on some of them that they seem kind of compressed or distorted in some way. And so the distortions you see in these heads, are the reason they look twisted is because they were literally just put in a metal can and kind of squished compressed on transportation. And so these skulls that we see in 2011 in the Charité, they come from a concentration camp which is the end result of a genocide which has happened in Namibia and killed 80% of the Herero people, 50% of the Nama people. And so when we're back in that room and everyone's upset, that's what they're upset about. They're coming to this thing, looking at skulls which had been in a concentration camp, looking out at them, and there's a German minister on stage refusing to apologize.
Okay, so let's come back to 2011.
We spoke with 3 people who are actually all from different places following the event really closely.
I'm Israel Kaunachika, born in Namibia. I sent the documents to the Herero chief, Sirirwako. I said, there are skulls here of our people. So what can we do?
My name is Larissa Förster. I'm a cultural anthropologist.
My name is Nandi. Madeingo is my surname. I'm the chairperson of the Herero Genocide Foundation.
Israel Kaunachike was actually there with the delegation before the ceremony. If you remember, like Peter was talking about all those people at the ceremony wearing those customized military uniforms.
Some people, when they passed our hotel in Motel 1, the Germans, they come and say, "Well, the military, these are military guys." They thought we're from the military, but I don't like uniforms. Myself, I didn't wear a uniform, but all these Hereros, so big guys.
And already, from the time they arrived, there was this feeling that, well, the Germans weren't giving this whole situation the same weight as it had in Namibia.
Even to welcome the delegation at the airport, nobody appeared. So this is why we were angry. These people, they were very respectless.
Larissa Förster was also at the handover ceremony.
There was this different weight given to the event on both sides. You would understand in Namibia, that it was so much more significant, so much more important on the Namibian side. And you could also understand the disappointment of the Namibian delegation coming here and seeing that this was also not all over the newspapers in Germany, while in Namibia it was all over the newspapers. It was the front page on that very day in each Namibian newspaper, including photographs, etc. Expectations ran high during this handover ceremony that a German government representative would eventually do what Namibians had been waiting for, actually for decades already, and that would be acknowledge the genocide and apologize for the genocide as the broader context in which these ancestral remains had been abducted. But that did not happen.
The disappointment started right at the airport, right when they arrived. There was no welcoming committee. No German representative met the Namibian delegation. They were just left alone to make their way to the Motel 1. And then, when it came time for the ceremony, Germany didn't send their foreign minister at the time, who was Heiko Maas. They sent a low-ranking minister, Cornelia Pieper.
We didn't expect Pieper. We wanted a minister who was responsible. They didn't respect the whole ceremony. She just came there to give a statement, a very fast statement, not mentioning apology, reparation, because it was the process now of the beginning of our process with Germany to demand the reparation. And we expected apology from them, official apology, right on the right there, the Charité, but not to hear blah blah. The African community, so they were prepared and they knew that this government or the Miss Pieper or whatever she is, she will never say anything. She will never apologize. Just a statement as usual.
Cornelia Pieper, the Minister of State of the Foreign Ministry at the time, talked about colonialism, but did not apologize, but kind of jumped, to the conclusion that there would be an opportunity for reconciliation through this handover.
Reconciliation. The German word, you can hear it, is Versöhnung. She says, on behalf of the German government, I ask the Namibian people for reconciliation. And then she's drowned out for a minute by people yelling and basically demanding, apologize. And her speech ended like this, in an uproar.
An audience member shouts, "Where is the pronunciation of genocide?" And in response, she walks towards the door of the auditorium and she just leaves.
The German government has still not gotten around to use the term genocide in its fullest sense or in its fullest meaning.
That's Nandi Madingo of the Herero Genocide Foundation.
They are offering a qualified admission to say it is genocide only if you look at it from today's perspective.
If you Google it, you might see that Germany has made an apology for the genocide in Namibia. But what Nandi's saying is that's not true.
So the Germans have never been serious about this thing. They are still not serious. They still have not admitted guilt to that crime. You see, for many people, genocide is its history. This genocide is history. But for us, it's the present day reality, because it is what defines our society today. The landlessness, the displacement, the destitution, all of these things are so present, and they're so present, because of the genocide.
So in that auditorium in Berlin, there's a feeling of frustration that despite the evidence for this unspeakable crime being right there on the table, Germany's still unwilling to take responsibility. But in Namibia, the atmosphere is completely different.
Now, over 100 years since they were taken in tin cans and sent back to Germany, they're on a plane on the way back home to Namibia, where they'll land at the Hosea Kutako airport just outside of Windhoek. And Larissa Forster is on that plane too.
What was really amazing was the arrival in Windhoek at Hosea Kutako airport.
When they took off from Germany, that evening, Very many of us did not sleep. We were congregated there, and then I think around 4 or 5 in the morning, that's when we then transferred to the airport.
In Namibia, it was a sensation. The whole people came on horses, maybe about thousands of people.
And I remember it was literally half the community was there to see it for themselves.
When this airplane arrived, people literally stormed onto the airfield, and security was helpless. I mean, they couldn't prevent it. So the plane was actually in the middle of civilians, Namibian citizens that had stormed onto the airfield out of, excitement.
To the extent that even they broke the doors and whatever, and then they ran onto the planes, and people were on the tarmac, just wanting to get a grab of their leaders who had, brought these remains back home.
And there was songs going on, there was performances going on.
Despite the fact that the ancestral remains are brought back to Namibia and are exhibited and shared across the entire country, they're not buried. Ultimately, they end up in a museum.
Maybe it's a question of naivete, because in 2011, very many of us maybe thought that the momentum have been gained so much so that we are almost moving to the finishing line, that the Germans would really now have no recourse or nowhere else to hide. And so this conversation is going to be concluded and they will do justice. They will just give us justice. So when time lapsed and that which had been brought in had not really gone anywhere else, it's still sitting in the museum. And today we hear the boxes or the skulls are sitting somewhere at the basement,
These human remains, they go back to the National Museum of Namibia and they sit there as part of a collection. This is the start of something which happens where in Namibia there begins to be a sort of difference of opinion between the affected communities of the Herero and Nama, who would like their remains returned to be buried, and the national government, which wants to link them into a larger story.
Was the understanding that these remains would then come back and be buried by the other Herero people? Or did they know, okay, no, these are going to go to the museum or these are going to go somewhere in that moment?
For us, it's not even a conversation when there are dead people. Usually they are buried, The expectation was that people are brought back and they are returned. I mean, they are brought back and they are buried because burial is the natural process. This is what must happen. But obviously, other interest came in when the government got on board. Obviously, there are certain, regulations around. I don't know whether it's museums, heritage, and whatever else. And so this remains then became sort of the property of the state. Eventually, the decision was to keep them in the museums.
This is where we get into some further complications, because these human remains then become caught in a dispute between the affected communities on the one hand, the Herero and the Nama, and the national government on the other.
And that's why the topic of what to do with human remains is so interesting and so difficult. Restitutions are political events, and symbols matter.
And there's a darker symbolism here because that Namibian National Museum is actually on the site of one of those former German concentration camps.
It's a very sad story. It is indeed a site of the concentration camp, one of the biggest. The Windu concentration camp stood right there. Just because the current regime cannot fathom the idea of a history from a different era other than the era wherein they, as SWAPO and Ovambos, came to play the dominant role, they had to come and erect this ugly coffee maker looking like structure right on the site. We had stories that when this structure was being erected, bones of our people were actually being exhumed. They were being pulled out. And no proper ceremonies were taking place to rebury them. So it is a place that to us is an affront, is an insult to our history. It is an attempt at erasing that history.
Well, I think it's time to bury them. We have to do that. It is now high time.
We know that Germany still has a lot of human remains from Namibia.
Yeah.
Do we know approximately how many?
I think in the hundreds, because every day they discover new skull somewhere. And some people, they call me, yeah, we have a skull here, can we give it to you? I say, what? What can I do with the skull?
But that's the whole question here, what do we do with these skulls?
Yeah, that's kind of the whole problem of restitution.
Yeah, these skulls had different meanings and stood for different things at different times through their history. They've sort of been different objects throughout the whole period. When they were collected, they were products to sell to museums and collectors on the international market. To the scientists collecting them, they were proof of racial superiority. To the affected communities and descendants today, they were ancestors, while to the politicians in Namibia, maybe they would be evidence in an argument about why Germany should pay reparations or development aid.
Yeah, and then to museums like the ones in Berlin we've been talking about, they can be radioactive. They can represent a sort of dark logic behind the whole project that they're trying to archive.
Yeah, I think for a lot of the museums, they want to sort of get rid of these things in order that they stop troubling their entire collections. They're a kind of difficult object that they're looking for a way to get rid of.
Remember the Kiwelus from Tanzania who came over to Berlin to encounter the skull of their ancestors? The two we played at the very beginning of the episode. They spoke, remember, about a museum director who said he was having a tiny coffin prepared in case their grandfather was going to be allowed to be returned. Yeah, that museum director is Bernhard Heeb.
And he's in charge of the S collection, the archive of thousands of human skulls, many of which are from former German colonies.
So we want to know, all things considered, who has the power to decide what's going to happen to all of these ancestral remains?
Let's just ask very simply. If we have a skull inscribed with a place or a name or area on it, why can't we return that to the places that it seems to be from?
Theoretically, we could do that, and we would love to do that, but we need the agreement of the government, For example, Tanzania, we now have families, and they want to have it back, and that's their right to have it back. If you ask me, I would bring them tomorrow back. It's not about what I want. It's about that we can't give back human remains with a certain political importance without asking at least the agreement of the government, And to be honest, the government didn't move an inch so far. After we finished our work, we gave lists and information to all of the embassies and also to the communities in Tanzania, and the communities were very open, and they want their ancestors back. But none of the governments we contacted so far, it's not a priority, obviously. And as long as they don't agree or don't ask for it, after all, or at least say, do what you want, we can't give them back.
But so what's up? Why can't they? Why? I'm a bit confused, because it seems like it would be valuable for them to have for the governments even.
Don't ask me.
No theory at all?
As far as I am informed, it caused quite a lot of internal conflicts in Namibia, and maybe that's only a theory, that the governments of Rwanda or Tanzania are afraid of internal conflicts which cause them. If you give back a chief, that's a powerful symbol. Yes? I'm really also confused because the question is why? What's the problem? Why don't you get back your ancestors and bury them or make a monument? It's up to you then. But at the moment, for me, I think it's quite frustrating. I don't know for the communities, it must be super frustrating at the moment. But I don't have any idea what's the real reason for this. Okay.
So is there intra-societal sort of power structures that can reopen colonial wounds in some kind of way if it's not done correctly?
You know what means correctly. So what it could trigger there, I can't predict. And after all, maybe even the countries can't predict. So there is no correct or incorrect, But maybe we are pressing things which should not be pressed, because I don't know if we are the ones who can tell each country that they have to get it back now because we want to give them back. It seems for me a little bit, I don't know if it's also a very European-centric view, but now we are ready to give them back, so you have to accept that we want to give them back. What? Maybe they have their own schedule and their own problems. And what if they say we don't want them back? What do we do now? Nobody talks about that because everybody says if we want to give them back, then they have to go back. Maybe they don't go back, I don't know. It would not be a big surprise for me if after all maybe most of them would not go back. I don't know.
Yeah. So there can be the case that some community wants them back, you want to give them back, but the state power resists.
This is, it's not likely, but it's possible. Okay.
But who profits from having these remains, I guess, is the question. Does Germany profit from having these remains?
I don't see the point about that, no. So that's a good question, but maybe because nobody profits, nobody wants them. Maybe there is nobody who profits of them, except the communities, but they are not in charge and not in power. And it's a good question about power. Who has the power? It's not about who has a profit, it's about who has the power. And you could also think that the countries could use them as some kind of token, that they say, okay, we want them back, but we want not only repatriation, we want reparation. And you know what starts then? Then everything stopped from the German side, in my opinion. It's only an idea, but I don't think that Germany wants to talk with each country about billions of reparation. And if this is the case, if the countries connect both repatriation and reparation, I think none of the skulls will go back. Because Namibia was one thing, they gave back the skulls, and now they had a discussion for how many years, and the result was 1 billion, which is a reparation from Germany to Namibia, which is, I think, I will not say ridiculous, 1 billion is a lot of money, but after all, is it sufficient? And why should Tanzania take back the skulls if they could connect it to reparation? So you don't know what's going on in the background, and therefore maybe what the communities want is not important for the state. It's the same game, isn't it?
I'm interested in this question that you raised. Let's say, for whatever reason, you can't return the remains and they have to stay here. What do you think should be done with them then?
I would say that we should at least get to an agreement with the communities and the states what should be done. Should they be buried with a certain ritual? I think at least what we could do in the case like that, we could get to an agreement with the communities. So how to store them, if we should bury them, whatever. Maybe we haven't thought about all possibilities about that then.
And in fact, there was a burial. We've spoken about human remains from Tanzania and Namibia, and there's been a sort of inability to get some of these ancestral remains returned.
Right. In episode 1, we spoke about why did these things get here, and this time we're talking about why can't they go back. And in each case, there's a legacy of German history that remains somehow problematic. But in the next episode, we want to talk about another site of human remains in Berlin, which was dealt with in a different way. In 2014, construction workers on the campus of the Free University were digging a trench, and they uncovered several pits that were filled with human bones.
Yeah, we're definitely going to go into this because this was a site of medical research that may have contained remains of people killed in Auschwitz.
Right, and the way that these remains were dealt with was slightly different from the other cases.
Yeah, but for all that, we're going to have to wait another month or so for episode 3. Dig Where You Stand is created by Ben Schumann-Stoller and Peter Matthews. It's a production of Colo Media, presented by the Berliner Magazine. This episode, episode 2, was produced by Ben Schumann-Stoller, Peter Matthews, and Rowan Ben Jackson. Music by Lawrence Van Oswald, mix and sound by Rowan Ben Jackson. We're also at digwhereyoustand.show and Dig Where You Stand Show on Instagram, where you can find some extra material we share that doesn't really fit into these episodes.
Yeah, and of course we'll let you know when the next episode of Dig Where You Stand comes out in about a month.
Yeah, we want to say thank you to everyone we spoke to, including Israel Kanachike, Nandi Maliengo, Larissa Forster, Bernhard Heeb, Zablon and Sindato Kiwelu, Konradin Kunze, and everyone else that's helped in this episode.
Yeah, thanks very much.